They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms, but it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. Our first stop on our cursed treasure hunt takes us to the dangerous Cheshire marshlands. In 1984, the remains of a man who had died in suspicious circumstances was discovered, but revealing his identity would become a murder mystery for the ages.
A peat cutter working on Lindow Moss in the Cheshire countryside spotted what he thought was a bit of wood, so he tossed it away. But as it landed, it was revealed not as a piece of wood. The peat which had surrounded this object fell away, and what was revealed was a human foot.
As the peat workers stared down at the foot, they experienced shock, but not surprise. This wasn't the first time they'd encountered human cadavers in the bog. Indeed, it had a macabre reputation.
People have been falling into Lindow Moss and drowning there throughout recorded history, not very often, but at regular intervals.
The previous year, in 1983, a human head had been found, a female head, and a local man had confessed to murdering his wife and getting rid of her body in Lindow Moss.
The human foot that had been discovered wasn't a clue to a modern-day murder. Instead, it was the first chapter in a story of appalling violence that took place nearly 2,000 years earlier.
That gruesome discovery was one of the most significant archaeological finds of the century.
Because the peat diggers knew where this peat had come from, they were able to go back to the find spot and direct the archaeologists and the forensic scientists to the rest of the body that was very carefully excavated as a large block, and then that was taken to the British Museum, where it could be excavated under controlled conditions.
When they discovered it, they even named him Pete Marsh as a joke because of where he was found.
Maybe it was the incredible preserved condition of Pete Marsh, or Lindow Man as he became known, that made him more human to those who saw him. This was no collection of bones, but the figure of a man trapped in time.
In its day, the finding of Pete Marsh made the national and international media. He was a real sensation. The kids at the local school created a song for him. There were T-shirts painted with Lindow Man. It was a really big media sensation.
Bog bodies are almost like the European equivalent of an Egyptian mummy. Peat is a wonderful medium for preserving human tissue. The bones have dissolved, but what they've left behind is his skin, his hair and his nails.
The timing of his discovery chimed with great forensic science advances, radiocarbon dating advances, the ability to investigate things like the insects found in the peat, that enabled us to tell a really rich story about his life, the landscape in which he was buried, and indeed his death.
But despite advances in science and technology, all efforts at archaeological CSI to unravel the mystery of Lindow Man seem to turn up more questions than answers.
The radiocarbon dating revealed conflicting dates between the body itself and the surrounding marsh. So the surrounding marsh was dated to around 300 BC, whereas the actual remains of the body dated from around 2 BC to around about 119 AD.
The man had been in his 20s. He was of average height and weight. He had a distinctive furrowed brow and a closely trimmed beard and moustache.
Didn't seem to have any evidence of like hard manual labour. So some people have suggested he may have actually been part of a kind of royal elite or high status individual.
However privileged Lindo Man's life had been, the discovery of his body became considerably less charmed. Ugly arguments broke out between the people of Cheshire and the archaeological elite in London.
He was taken to the British Museum in London, despite a vociferous campaign from people in the Northwest. They argued that his remains belonged in a museum in Manchester.
He might have been 2,000 years old, but he was seen as something of a local boy. And so certainly in Northern England, he's always been really iconic. And there've been sort of campaigns to have him brought back to the north, where some of us believe he does belong.
The disagreement about where Lindo Man should be displayed was an ominous portent of what was to come. The team of experts in London made a shocking discovery. It suggested, however Lindo Man may have lived, he met a truly cursed end.
Lindo Man had been subjected to an extraordinarily vicious, violent, and extended death.
It was the forensic specialists that were involved in the case that brought to the study an understanding of the trauma he had suffered. He was taken out into the depths of the bog. We know that he's brought to his knees with a blow that fractures a left rib.
There were quite a few injuries that were found on his body. He was hit by what appears to be like a V-shaped axe going into his head.
His throat is also cut.
But there was no clue as to why Lindo Man had been murdered in such a savage way. Differing schools of theory emerged, leading to conflict and disagreement that continues to this day, and casts a shadow over this most remarkable of discoveries.
Modern criminologists have a word to describe this type of homicide: overkill. And the ample evidence of overkill on Lindo Man's body led scientists to believe that he had been the victim of ritual sacrifice.
Based on our work with other bog bodies that exhibit exactly these same wounds, the blow to the head, the throat cut, the stabbing and so forth, this was a very ceremonial way to die.
There are historians who argue passionately that the whole idea of him having been sacrificed is nonsense. They point to a more prosaic motive for his death: robbery.
The decades since the discovery have done little to calm the fervour of these conflicting theories. But as Pete Marsh was laid out as the British Museum's prize exhibit, preserved in a glass case for all to see, a new storm was brewing.
There are persistent criticisms that this display, this exhibition, doesn't truly honour his sacrifice and pay enough respect to him. He's just an object rather than a person who died.
Should Lindo Man still be on display, or should he be buried again, like in a ceremonial way, put back to where he came from?
When Lindo Man first went on display in the British Museum, he was given pride of place at the top of the steps. But bog bodies have this peculiar power to confront us with something that looks quite like ourselves. And that's why the British Museum have kind of gently turned the case away from the main thoroughfare. So you have to seek him out. You have to know he's there almost and go to see him, go to meet him.
Ultimately, if there is a curse associated with Lindo Man, but that's aside from the violent and protracted death he himself suffered, it is that his discovery has led to a scientific and cultural argument which shows no sign of dying down.
To all you countryside lovers who may walk the Lindo Moss, who knows what other tortured souls may be entombed in the peat beneath your feet? Our next stop on our cursed treasure hunt takes us to a place synonymous with golden moments of the silver screen. We are heading to Hollywood in the 1950s, to a time when legendary actor John Wayne was cast in the unlikely role of a fearsome 12th century warlord, Genghis Khan. He was hoping to strike box office gold, but instead found box office poison.
Hollywood has a lengthy history of producing movies which cause chaos and catastrophe on location and lead to disaster, even death, for the cast and crew. But few films have a reputation as dark as a 1956 John Wayne epic, The Conqueror, about the Mongolian warlord Genghis Khan.
Throughout the history of Hollywood, there have been stars who've become national treasures. John Wayne certainly achieved this status as the #1 draw of his day. But there was one John Wayne film that stands out, not for its success, but because its production and aftermath became engulfed with bad fortune and enduring rumors of a curse, all starting with the movie's star billing.
This has come to be regarded as one of the most ridiculous instances of miscasting in the history of Hollywood.
It was a bit of a joke. Even John Wayne admits that he was totally out of character.
All of this created the enduring reputation of a film that was quite literally toxic.
In the summer of 1955, filming for The Conqueror was in its final stages in the Escalante Valley near St. George, Utah. On the surface, it seemed uneventful by Hollywood standards. But closer scrutiny reveals a story of giant egos, ill-conceived ideas, and a nuclear bomb called Dirty Harry.
The Conqueror was originally written for and planned for Marlon Brando, but John Wayne was then at the height of his fame and influence in Hollywood, and he really wanted the role of the hero, Genghis Khan. And what John Wayne wanted, producers were inclined to give him.
From a certain perspective, you could see why The Conqueror was made. Historical epic films were very popular, very profitable at the time. It also makes sense to cast John Wayne in a historical adventure movie because of his background in westerns, which are really the quintessential form of Hollywood historical adventure movie.
John Wayne was an actor of some ability, but he clearly was out of his depth with trying to play Genghis Khan.
At the time The Conqueror was made, RKO Pictures was owned by the famously eccentric American businessman Howard Hughes. The film had a budget of about $6 million, which was relatively high for the time.
But it wasn't just money that was showered on the production and its stars. Throughout filming, a strange dust rained down on props, sets, equipment, and the ground itself.
The cast and the crew spent several weeks on location filming in amongst the dust and dirt. At the end of filming, 60 tons of dirt from Escalante Valley were transported back to Hollywood to give authenticity to studio-based reshoots.
And the dirt of St. George, Utah, on the boots and in the lungs of the Conqueror's cast and crew would prove to haunt all those associated with the production for years to come. Following the film's release in February 1956, members of the crew mysteriously started falling ill.
And that illness was no mere mild sickness, it was the dreaded cancer. The first to succumb was one of the cast. He contracted kidney cancer in 1960, and when he was told it was terminal, he killed himself. Next, 3 years later, the director contracted cancer of the throat and the neck. In the years after that, 5 of the leading names on the bill would all succumb to cancer. And of the 220 members of the cast and crew, 41% had developed cancer.
It turned out the seemingly innocuous dirt of Utah had been contaminated by a huge nuclear bomb tested the previous year in neighboring Nevada. And the name of the dirty bomb contaminating the dirt of Utah, Dirty Harry.
The Atomic Energy Commission detonated over 100 nuclear bombs at the Nevada test site between 1951 and 1962. The site in Nevada was chosen partly because the prevailing winds would tend to blow the radioactive dust from the tests away from major population centers like Las Vegas and towards more sparsely populated areas in Arizona and southern Utah.
T0.
So the dust had been nuclear fallout. And even more shockingly, the producers had known exactly what it was, even before they settled upon it as their filming location.
The filmmakers relied on advice and reassurances from the US government, which said there was no danger. In fact, a leaflet distributed in the area at the time said your best action is not to worry about the fallout.
It didn't take long for the scandal of the nuclear fallout to hit the headlines.
The latter-day press attention that the film received led to the film being dubbed an RKO radioactive picture, which is, of course, a pun on the studio name of RKO Radio Pictures. Howard Hughes owned RKO and reportedly bought up every print of The Conqueror and took it out of circulation.
We'll never know if Howard Hughes's actions reflected the scandal of the nuclear fallout, or the fallout from the radioactive reviews of the film. Nevertheless, the myth of The Conqueror as the first movie that killed its crew would be further fueled by John Wayne publicly blaming his stomach cancer on exposure to radiation during filming.
Television, newspapers, books, websites all regurgitate the story of this movie that killed its cast and crew. But look a little more closely at the evidence and the picture becomes rather less clear.
John Wayne was a heavy smoker. Different accounts of his habit have him smoking between 4 and 6 packs of cigarettes per day. He eventually died of stomach cancer, and there are established links between stomach cancer and smoking, whereas the kinds of cancer that are more likely to be caused by radiation exposure are things like leukemia.
US government statistics show that at the time, the rate of people expected to develop cancer was 40%. So that meant from a cast and crew of 220 that 88 would have been expected statistically to develop cancer within their lifetimes. Well, that's just 3 fewer than the number reported.
In the years since the Nevada nuclear bomb tests, the locals of St. George, Utah, have consistently claimed their rates of cancer are higher as a direct result of the radioactive fallout, and that the government is guilty of a cover-up. But what of the legacy of the ill-fated John Wayne movie and the star itself?
When the evidence is examined carefully, it becomes clear that the only curse which really affected The Conqueror was the script and the appalling decision to cast John Wayne as a 12th century Mongolian warlord.
Our next stop on our cursed treasure hunt takes us to Hereford in England. There, a discovery of riches should have brought joy for its lucky finders. But gold fever beset them, leaving a trail of devastation and misery in its wake.
The world is awash in stories of cursed treasure, ancient hexes, jinxes, or curses laid on people who dare to disturb these priceless artifacts. But in 2015, a rather more mundane reality emerged, and it's one which suggests that, at least in some cases, there's a very different explanation, and that explanation is not paranormal or supernatural. It is the twin curses of greed and stupidity.
They cursed themselves from the outset as soon as they saw what they had.
they're going to regret it for the rest of their lives. They could have been very, very rich men.
In 2015, 2 metal detectorists were out searching the fields around Leicester in Herefordshire in the hope of finding some buried treasure. They'd driven from South Wales looking to explore an area of land known as Kingshall Hill. We may never know whether the name was what drew them to this place, or if they'd had a tip-off from the finds of fellow detectorists.
George Powell and Leighton Davies moved their metal detectors over the fields, and the detectors pinged, and they dug in the earth. And to their astonishment, they found not a handful of bones or old artifacts. The treasure trove, which Powell and Davies discovered, was one of the most important archaeological finds of 21st century Britain.
The 2 men had discovered what became known as the Herefordshire Hoard, a collection of 300 coins and gold and silver jewellery. A find which would rewrite the history of Britain in the Dark Ages, and whose value was put as high as £12 million. It would make George Powell and Leighton Davies very famous indeed.
They realised almost immediately this was a priceless haul. But before they pulled all of this buried treasure from the earth, Powell decided to record the moment for posterity.
Powell pulled out his phone, photographing the remarkable discovery, before he and Davies loaded up the loot and drove back to South Wales, where they made their second big mistake. Unable to contain their excitement, they posted some of the pictures of their discovery on social media.
They initially put some photographs of some of the coins, and on the basis of that, people encouraged them to actually hand them in. There's a time limit to when you have to report material.
The definition of treasure is actually any object of gold or silver that is over 300 years old, that's been found in the ground. It's also a group of coins, and again, it's largely precious metal, but it can also be base metal coins as well.
As Powell and Davies contemplated the artifacts, they knew they had 14 days to report the hoard to the authorities. Indeed, they knew the procedure, as they'd handed in at least one small find in the past.
I think they saw the find of a lifetime. I mean, this is everything they've dreamt of. And I think at that moment they had 2 choices, and they made the wrong one.
They decided they weren't going to report what they had dug up. Instead, they took their haul to a handful of not terribly scrupulous dealers and decided to sell it on the black market.
But unfortunately for Powell and Davies, word of their malfeasance had already spread.
Most of the metal detecting community know who each other are, and they know what's going on, and they will obviously report if they think that one of their group has been doing things that are illegal. It was a metal detector contact of Peter Reeville who actually told him in the first place about the find.
When I started to hear rumours of a massive hoard being found and no evidence of it being brought into the museum, I was really worried. We get lots of rumours like that, but I kept hearing the same thing from different people. I was also given 2 names, and one of those names I had an email address for. So I thought, well, I'll just write to them and say, I think you found treasure, and under the Act you have 14 days to report it. I had a very terse email back saying, I don't know what you're talking about. That didn't ring true. It didn't match up with the information that I had.
Essentially, I think they realised they weren't going to get away with it. What they have was far too hot to handle. They could be in real trouble.
Powell and Davies started to panic, but rather than coming clean and admitting they'd found something incredible in the soils of Herefordshire, they made a cunning but ultimately foolish move.
3 or 4 days later, both individuals took some finds into Cardiff Museum, and in amongst those were items which we know to be part of the Herefordshire hoard.
Among a selection of lesser artifacts were some beautiful pieces of jewellery that would turn out to be more than 1,000 years old. But amongst the treasures, it was in fact the two modest-looking coins that opened a window on a previously dark and little understood chapter of Britain's history.
The two emperor coins are amazingly rare, and they represent coins struck by Alfred of Wessex alongside Ceolwulf II of Mercia. The design on the back, in this case, the two emperors are the two monarchs sat at a table with an angel over the top of them.
It's of national significance because for the first time it was realised that there was actually a very strong alliance between two major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the late 9th century while they were trying to fight off the Vikings.
The Vikings raided monasteries dotted across the English kingdoms, stole, looted the gold and silver treasure and coins from the monastery treasuries, and they also seized booty from the armies they defeated. The hoard, which Powell and Davis discovered, was almost certainly owned by a Viking warlord, and he had probably buried it underneath the soil after a battle or for safekeeping, planning to come back to it. But there it had lain until these two amateur detectorists dug it up.
Powell and Davies's troubles had only just begun. Their descent into the realms of greed and criminality led some to think that the Herefordshire hoard must be cursed.
When they eventually did go to Cardiff Museum and say, we have found some treasure, of course, at the time, they believed that they would, I suppose, get away with handing over that small amount. But already the metal detecting world knew that so much more than that had been found.
I phoned the coroner and said, I don't think we're getting anywhere. I think we need to move on. And he contacted West Mercia Police to ask them to start an investigation. They called on the service of an archaeologist, and in this case, it was me. So I was asked by West Mercia Police to go to South Wales with them on their raids.
Hidden in the suspects' houses, there were more coins that could be traced to the hoard. Experts could tell from the marks on the coins that they had been stored on top of each other. But Powell and Davis insisted these few extra coins were the last remnants of their find.
Powell and Davis, they were charged with theft, conspiracy to conceal, and converting criminal property. So 3 charges for them.
The evidence was pretty stunning, really. The photographs that Powell had taken of the hoard in the hole in the ground were used against them.
These photos showed objects in the ground, objects when they dug them up, and a huge mass of silver coins, probably more than 300 silver coins, spread out on a carrier bag with the items of jewellery.
One of the photos that was retrieved off the mobile phone showed a palm, and in that palm was a coin that had 2 emperors on it. And the fingerprint expert in court gave evidence over a number of days, and they were able to prove that that was the palm belonging to George Powell.
On Friday, the 22nd of November 2019, George Powell and Leighton Davis were found guilty of stealing the Herefordshire hoard. The curse of the Viking treasure trove had struck again. Powell was jailed for 10 years, while Davies got 8.5.
The shock on the defendants' faces, I don't think they expected that to happen. I don't think they expected to be found guilty right up to the last possible moment. When the judge was giving the sentence, he basically told the defendants how stupid they'd been. If they had declared the treasure, they could have expected a half or a third share. Between them, they could have been multi-millionaires, and instead, they became criminals that went to prison.
18 years between the two of them is hardly anything when you consider the value of the hoard and the fact that they'd stolen our history from us. They'd stolen it from every school child who wanted to go into the museum and see this hoard.
But the curse of the Herefordshire hoard wasn't finished with Powell and Davies. In December 2022, the misfortune that had plagued them continued during a new court hearing, at the end of which they were fined £600,000 each for continuing to refuse to divulge what they'd done with the hoard.
So their time in jail hasn't meant that they've learnt their lesson. They still think that they can profit from this crime.
So the Herefordshire hoard lives on in the underworld, biding its time before emerging again to curse those who handle it.
I feel very sad about it. If they'd have done what most metal detectorists would have done, this would have been a sensational and very positive story. And we've lost that.
And there is the real curse of the Viking hoard. It's the eternal, enduring curse of man's greed.
A treasure trove can bring great riches, but also great misfortune. Should you find one, be sure to declare it, or a jail cell could await. We tend to associate curses with objects of beauty or from the ancient past. But if ever there was a modern-day curse, it may be found in 1914 in Sarajevo. There, a fateful car journey would ultimately lead to the death of millions on the battlefields in Europe.
If there's an A-list of cursed treasures, items from history, both ancient and modern, which have trailed doom, death and destruction in their wake, Franz Ferdinand's car would be pretty high up in the top 10. For more than 50 years, an unshakable popular belief has grown up that this car was cursed, that it played a pivotal role in not just starting the slaughter of World War I, but causing a litany of extraordinary and gory deaths to those who owned or rode in the car.
The fateful story begins in June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, went on a royal visit to Sarajevo, capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina.
What was totally new, he decided to take his wife with him. She was only a duchess, so she was very low regarding her social rank. And in Vienna, she was not really liked. So Franz Ferdinand wanted to show her that he loves her. So he convinced her, come on, please join me, because Bosnia-Herzegovina is a beautiful landscape, Sarajevo is interesting, and this is the reason why both were in Sarajevo.
They toured through the streets of Sarajevo in a car which had been lent to them by an Austrian army officer, and it was a phaeton, an open-topped, fairly rudimentary but luxury saloon.
The choice of car was to be the first in a litany of bad decisions that contributed to one of the most calamitous events in history.
They should take a Mercedes. But Sophie went down, and it was a lovely Sunday morning. It was warm. She said, oh, it's so warm. And the Grevenstift had already removed the soft top. And she said, oh, this looks nice. I want to take this car. So the Mercedes was not taken.
The car was a 1910 Graf and Stift double phaeton. It was made by the Graf brothers in Vienna, who'd only recently moved on from making bicycles.
The car is a really fantastic car. It was one of the most expensive cars you could buy in Austria at that time. It was 15,500 crowns. You could purchase a family house for that money. So it's a luxury car. It has a cabin scheduled to take 5 passengers and a driver.
Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were in the third car in a convoy of 7. Heading towards the town hall and soaking up the atmosphere, they were blissfully unaware of what lay ahead.
The situation was quite happy because thousands of people were standing on the roads and cheering and had black and yellow flags and say, hooray, hooray, because the first time an archduke was there.
At one point, a group of somewhat inept Serbian nationalists lobbed a grenade at the car.
It exploded behind and injured some of his staff.
Franz Ferdinand was furious about the attack. and was determined to voice his displeasure.
He said, "Oh my God, you have not a very nice town if you're welcomed by a bomb." And everybody was really shocked. All the other events of the afternoons were cancelled.
Franz Ferdinand decided that he and his wife should go and visit the injured, the people who'd been in the car following.
Now the whole tragic story started because the whole route changed, and the car drivers had only the main routes in their mind. And the driver of the Crown Prince couple's car was not from Sarajevo.
The Archduke's driver took a wrong turn on the way to the hospital, leading them right into the path of assassin Gavril Princip.
Princip, a Serbian pro-nationalist student, had been nursing his frustration at the failure of the grenade attack on the Archduke. When the convoy unexpectedly moved into view, he couldn't believe his luck at being able to approach without hindrance and empty his automatic pistol into the Archduke's vehicle.
The first shot was meant to kill the general of the town, General Boturek, but the bullet missed, went to the left, went through the board of the car and hit Sophie, and she got unconscious immediately and fell down with her head on the knees of Franz Ferdinand, and opened the way for the second bullet. And he fired his second shot and hit Franz Ferdinand into the neck. And it was a very unlucky hit because one of the main veins was hit, the windpipe was hit, and by and by Franz Ferdinand was drowning by his own blood.
Both Franz Ferdinand and his wife were mortally wounded. They died within minutes.
Franz Ferdinand's assassination was momentous. It triggered the war to end all wars. After the Archduke's death, Austria declared war on Serbia, and their allies, Germany, joined in. Russia, Great Britain and France supported Serbia, and the Great War began.
Within 4 years, 10 million men would be killed in the filth and the mud of the battlefields.
Given the horror and tragedy triggered by his death, stories of curses and supernatural forewarnings circulated about Franz Ferdinand for years afterwards.
The Archduke was a prolific hunter, and in 1913 he shot a very rare white stag. According to local hunting tradition, that was extremely bad luck, and that anyone who does shoot such an animal would be dead within a year. It's rumoured that a month before he died, the Archduke told some friends that he thought he was going to be killed.
Nobody understands why he shot this deer. Sometimes he had very melancholic feelings, and he said, maybe I will die before my time is there. Of course, later on, when we know what happened on the 28th of June, 1914, these sayings get some power.
But the curse that really gripped the public's imagination was associated with the car he rode and died in.
The legend of the cursed car of Franz Ferdinand begins after the armistice in 1918. And according to this legend, the car was acquired by the governor of Yugoslavia, but it didn't bring him much fortune.
He lost an arm in an accident. He passed it on to a doctor friend who was killed. He passed it on to a Swiss racing driver who had a fatal accident.
In a race, the car catapulted this driver out of its cockpit and killed him. The car next moves on to a farmer, but one day when he was driving it, the car broke down. He called a fellow farmer, and the fellow farmer came out to tow the disabled car away. But suddenly, according to this story, the car growled into life, ran over the towing car and killed both farmers.
And finally, it was involved in an enormous accident at a wedding where no less than 4 people were killed.
The car then passed on to its final owner, the curator of a museum, who was apparently a bit superstitious and didn't really want ever to get into the car.
The car was said to have been bombed during World War II, after which only the steering wheel and a pair of severed hands were found.
The hands on the steering wheel were those of the unfortunate curator of the Vienna Museum, in which it had finally fetched up. He was its last tragic victim, some 3 decades after it was fired upon by Gavrilo Princip. It makes for a great tale, and is one that has persisted for decades. But is it true? The ultimate proof that the story is myth lies in the fact that the car has been in a museum in Vienna since 1914.
After the whole thing was done in Sarajevo, Count Harrach, he was the owner of the car, did not want to get the car back. He said, I don't want to have a car like this, where all the blood is there and my friend Franz Ferdinand was killed. So he gave it as a present to the emperor. And he said, Franz Ferdinand was a general, so I give it as a donation to the Museum of Military History. And since 1914, the museum is the owner, the legal owner of the car.
If you visit the museum, you'll see that the car is intact. It has been restored over time, but it was never blown up.
It's the most impressive object of this gallery because it has the bullet hole, it has the fragment damage of the first attempt with the hand grenade. So it is a symbol and it makes the whole story living, breathing. You are pulled into what happened on the 28th of June and sometimes you feel as standing at the road and seeing Franz Ferdinand crossing by and being shot.
Tales of the car being cursed didn't really start to appear until 1959, when Frank Edwards wrote a book called Stranger Than Science, in which he recalled how every subsequent owner of the car had either been killed or injured.
Edwards was an early adopter of UFO stories, and he was also a man with a purely accidental relationship with the truth. Every single version and variation of this elaborate story of death and destruction associated with the car traces back to Edwards and his book.
But could there be one final twist in the tale of Franz Ferdinand's car?
A British tourist named Brian Presland was visiting the museum and he noticed the number plate, which is A111118, which he took to read as Armistice 11/11/18.
The numbers could be read as being the date of the armistice, the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918.
For people from the West, they said, oh my God, it's a prophecy. For the Austro-Hungarian side, it has no prophecy because the 3 ones mean 3 in Latin, and our armistice was signed on the 3rd of November 1918.
And as for the letter at the beginning of the license plate,
the German word for armistice is Waffenstillstand, which very evidently does not begin with A.
the most infamous car in history is where it belongs, locked in a museum as a reminder of one of the darkest days in human history.